In the lectures that I've been doing publicly around the world, I have placed a fair amount of emphasis on responsibility. And I think that your emphasis on work and my emphasis on responsibility are likely the same thing. I've been trying to point out to the people who are listening to my lectures that most of the meaning that sustains people through crises in life is accrued as a consequence of adoption of responsibility. So if you have good social relations, if you have a good marriage, if you have good relations with your children and your friends and your colleagues at work, you have a good social community, that's all a consequence of the sacrifices you make in relationship to those social interactions, the amount you give, the amount you put forward, the responsibility that you take for the integrity of those relationships. And then when the crisis comes, as it will in your life, you'll have that to sustain you when the going gets hard. Hedonism isn't going to sustain you, and your whim isn't going to sustain you, but the meaning you can derive through the voluntary shouldering of responsibility, that's always there for you. And it seems to me that that's akin in some sense to the emphasis that you lay on the necessity of work. I don't think that there's any real difference between the concept of work and the concept of sacrifice. You know, I used to ask my students, many of whom were children of first-generation immigrants, trying to elucidate the concept of sacrifice, I'd say to them, what sacrifices did your parents make so that you could attend university in Canada? Of course, they had an instant answer to that because they knew perfectly well what their parents had sacrificed. And I don't think there is any difference between sacrifice and work. And I'm in some sense speaking in relationship to the biblical tradition here, is that you have to offer up something that you value in the present to make peace with the future. That really is the core element of work, and it's the core element of sacrifice, right? If you're just doing what you want, if you're just gratifying every whim, it's not work, but it doesn't work out very well for the future. What work seems to be is something like the continual sacrifice of at least some element of the present to ensure iterable stability across the long term. And so because human beings are self-conscious creatures and because we can see the future, we have to work. We have to integrate the present with the future. And that does seem to involve work, and that does seem to be the core element of responsibility. And I don't see how that responsibility can be shirked without catastrophe if it is precisely that which defines our iterable stability, both individually and socially. This is something that conservatives really have to offer young people, you know, and I don't think that the conservatives, generally speaking, have cottoned on to this, is to point out to young people that the sustaining meaning in your life will not be found in hedonistic self-gratification. It's a counterproductive strategy. The sustaining meaning in your life will be found in the voluntary shouldering of as much responsibility as possible. You know, young people, they get that. As soon as you explain it to them, they understand. They understand immediately and are vastly relieved to hear it.
Well, it also takes you back to a point you'd made earlier, which is that people get to a point where they want a meaning larger than themselves. And that's part of this, that ultimately you find a better life by focusing beyond yourself, not by focusing inside yourself.
Well, and that inside yourself is such a peculiar formulation, which I think is why the radicals insist so much on feeling. Because when I hear that as a psychologist, I think, well, what self do you mean? And the rejoinder is usually, well, that's self-evidence. Like, well, no, actually it's not. Because if you're acting in your own best interest, all things considered, you're not giving way to every momentary whim. All that does is put you in the position of a dependent 2-year-old or a psychopath. And none of that's productive. Even if you're abiding by your own true self in the higher sense, then you're going to make sacrifices of your momentary whims to your medium to long-term stability and thriving. And that's exactly what happens when you mature, because 2-year-olds have that proclivity to be governed by whim, but nobody thinks that 2-year-olds should rule the world. Well, except maybe 2-year-olds.
Well, I think, again, you get back to some of the current fads, which would suggest to you that 2- and 3-year-olds can actually make real decisions, which I think is an example of what I meant about being insane. And anybody who thinks that a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old is prepared to make adult decisions is just literally living in a world that I have no relationship to, and I can't understand. But I think there's also, part of the challenge is that historically, almost every society I know of that's successful has rites of passage which takes you through adolescence into adulthood, sometimes at a pretty early age, sometimes at 12 or 13. But it's made very clear to you that you have been a child and that children are allowed to do a whole range of things, but that we don't take what they did as children seriously. It's not like you're a small adult, you're a child. And then you go through a rite, whether you are, in almost every culture I'm aware of, if it's a healthy culture, it has some provision for you to emerge as an adult and to now be self-aware that that the things you once did as a child are no longer appropriate. One of the problems of the current system is that we treat the children as though they're adults. There's no rite of passage. And so they end up as 35-year-old members of Congress who are, in fact, they're just large adolescents. They don't have any kind of sense of maturity or responsibility or any sense of the hierarchy of development. And they live in a world of now. I mean, in a funny kind of way, it's a remarkably existential moment where everything is now.
So what are you hoping for on the leadership front on the Republican side over the next couple of years? Or what do you think is going to happen? Are there going to be contenders in relationship to Trump, or is he the presumptive nominee? And should he be? What would you hope for as we move towards 2024?
Well, I think that he is the probable nominee, but not the presumptive nominee. I think that Governor DeSantis, if he wants to, can challenge him. Whether DeSantis could beat him, I don't know. But I think certainly Governor DeSantis has the capacity and is doing an astonishing job as governor of our third largest state. I think that there are other candidates who would like to be in that mix. And I always try to remind people, if you went back to this exact point in 2014, 2 weeks before the off-year election, nobody would even have said Trump's name. I mean, and I think people would have had a sense that Jeb Bush was probably the front runner. So to try to look forward, and I don't know at this point in 2018 that people would have picked Joe Biden. So in my mind, an amazing number of things can happen between now and the time we actually pick a nominee. Certainly Glenn Youngkin, the new governor of Virginia, has shown himself to be a future star of the party. I think there are other people around who are serious potential contenders. We're about to see Governor Brian Kemp of Georgia win a surprisingly big victory. I also think that there's a whole new generation coming up of people who are running around the country. And there are a whole bunch of senators. One of the ground rules of the U.S. Senate is that every senator combs the hair of a future president every morning and looks in the mirror and thinks, why not? So you could easily have 6 or 7 or 8 candidates from the Senate, at least starting down the road. So I would say that Trump is formidable and probably would be nominated, but he's not certain. I think on the Democratic side, if this election goes as badly as I suspect it will, and if Biden continues to decay, and if Kamala continues to be as totally incompetent as she is, I think you'll clearly see a whole new field of Democrats. And part of the question will be, if they get beaten badly this year, what lesson do they think they learn? I think the governor of California is likely to run, having learned nothing, and will try to convince the rest of us that California, in which San Francisco has become a disaster, and Los Angeles has the largest population of homeless in the country, but that somehow California is a model for the future. even as it loses businesses and people who are leaving the state because they can't stand it anymore. So, but he has so many resources that he almost has to run.